This is part 2 of a presentation titled The Effects and Side Effects of Our Choices from May 2020. In part 1 of the presentation, we looked at what Yang Zhao says about side effects in education. During part 1, you might have had a lot of questions arise in your mind, like, is she wearing pants? And even questions that are more important, like, okay, what should I do going forward? He asks us all these questions: what works for what works for whom, who and what get hurt by what works, but he doesn't leave any answers that are specifically for our situation. And that's because his point is that education should be individualized, that what works for one student or group may not work for the others. In fact, one student's medicine may be another student's poison, as he puts it. And so going forward here, we're going to look at a qualitative research tool that can help us take a look at reflecting on what decisions we're making and whether the consequences are what we intended or not. And while we're looking at this, we're going to be doing action research, and you're doing this in your classroom either formally or informally. Anytime you do a data dig and make decisions based on that, those kinds of things, it's action research, which is when we look at, we research or look into something that is going on, and then we decide what action we are going to take as educators. If you are new to data analysis, or you feel uncomfortable with it, as uncomfortable even as I feel with technology, or even if you don't, if you are quite comfortable with research, I recommend the DOE's class, the Fundamentals of Data Use. I took that last summer, and it was really fun. The director of South Dakota Stars, of SD Stars, he is the facilitator of the course, and he really helped us with understanding how to go through a process and pull some data and choose what we're going to be looking at and make a plan going forward. I was able to make a plan and meet with some students this year, and then of course my goal was the end of the year summative assessment, which we didn't take, but it doesn't matter, because the actions that I took based on looking at that data helped me improve to help the students improve their literacy skills, which are going to be helpful to them for functional literacy in life, which is much more important than the test result. In addition to quantitative research, we can also look at at things qualitatively. Now, a lot of us don't have end of the year quantitative test results, and we certainly do not have any longitudinal data about anything that we've done in fourth quarter, because this situation just happened to us and is happening to us right now. So there's never been a better time to look at things from a qualitative standpoint. I like to say, it's my opinion, that I look at quantitative data to see what's going on, and I look at qualitative data to see what's really going on. Thinking about an example from medicine, back to the time that my loved one was in the hospital. Earlier that day, he had gone in for an outpatient procedure, and they weren't able to get to the procedure that day, so he should have been sent home. But as he was sitting there waiting to get sent home, the nurse who was assigned to him looked at things from a qualitative viewpoint. There was nothing quantitatively that showed any problems. All the vital signs were fine. There's no reason he should have stayed there. He didn't even have the procedure. But the nurse that day was able to take a qualitative analysis of the situation and see that something was just not quite right. And she ended up calling up to the doctor and saying, I think this guy needs to be admitted. And he was. And later that day, he experienced a major medical event that could have ended his life. And he survived. And I believe it's because of the decisions of the nurse that day, that she was able to look at things qualitatively and see that even though there was no quantitative data that showed anything wrong, that something was not quite right. So in medicine, taking a qualitative analysis of something can save lives. And in our situation as educators, looking at things qualitatively helps us to see beyond. It helps us to see what's really going on in a situation, which includes how are things going for each and every participant in whatever we're doing. Oh, I wanted to say too, going back to the general action research one here, is that what I wanted to say is one thing that's been super inspirational is going to the TIE conference, or attending it, going to those sessions, and then the SDDOE conference that's going on right now. And those sessions will be posted later this month, and the TIE sessions are already online. There is so much that we can take from that, and maybe there's something that really inspired you and you think, I want to implement this. Well, this research tool that I'm showing you can help you figure out how best to implement that and to document what you're doing. And it could be one person doing this, or you can work together as a group. You can do a Google Doc and all write on it, and just keep it documented, because it's going to be very confusing. We don't know what we're doing next year as far as instruction, whether it's this contingency or that one or the other, or during the year some mixture of two or more of those, or if it will just change throughout the year. We don't know. So this can help us keep track of what we're doing, and then if we have to move to something else, oh, this is not going to be appropriate for this situation, but we want it documented so we can come back to that. Or it's not working in this context, but it might work in this context for these students. So in order to keep our thoughts together, I think that this research tool can be very helpful. We name what it is we're looking at, reflect upon it, and act. Make the decision, and then reflect upon it again. Keep going back around, a reflective cycle. The name of the tool is called the Critical Action Research Matrix application. Critical action research is action research where you're really keeping, I would say, an eye out for equity in a situation. This tool was developed by Dr. Leanne Putney and Dr. Joan Wink. I came to know it because I was a graduate student at UNLV, Go Rebels, where Dr. Putney was a professor, and she and her educational partner were starting a K-12 school, and I had the opportunity to help start the school and then to document a lot of what was going on with the school and to evaluate the after-school program. I did not know Dr. Joan Wink except by name, because she and Putney had written a book together called A Vision of Vygotsky, which I read years ago. When I came to South Dakota and decided to track down both of these researchers, I found out that Joan Wink lives in South Dakota. Some of you may know her. So we live on different sides of the state. She lives on the left side of the state, and I live on the right side of the state, but we are both in South Dakota. And their theory here is based on Freire, Vygotsky, and it's grounded in ethnography, which is a type of qualitative research where you're looking at the various viewpoints of all of the participants. And in the karma, you're looking at what was intended versus what was enacted from the perspectives of all levels of participants. So you're looking at what you thought you were going to do versus what happened. So this is how I put it. What do we want to be doing? What are we actually doing? And what are we going to do about it? The karma has 4 easy steps. You can do qualitative research in 4 easy steps. Step 1, record the expectations. What do you want to happen with this initiative that you're doing? How are participants to be served? What will be produced by the participants in the program? In step 2, you look at the evident implementation. What is actually happening? In step 3, you're just comparing step 1 versus step 2. What was expected versus what was evident? Was it congruent or divergent from what you had expected? And then in step 3, you're drawing conclusions and making recommendations for next steps. What are the implications of what we discovered when we compared and contrasted our expectations with the reality? Which aspects should we modify and which aspects should we maintain? Boy, I really loved this when I first saw this, because I was in a situation in which we were dealing with a lot of things that would just get discarded. They would try a program and then they would just eliminate it instead of modifying it and looking at, can it work in a different context? Might this work for a different group of students? Those kinds of things. Things were just like, we're starting this, it's eliminated. We're starting this, it's eliminated. So with this tool, you're looking at how you can modify things to meet the needs of each individual learner. In steps 1 and 2, you're just taking notes. It's a note-taking process, and you're writing down what is happening. In step 3, that's a note-making process, and that's where you're doing your reflection. Steps 1 and 2 are just the factual information. This is what we expect to happen. This is what's happening. In step 3, you're reflecting on on how that aligned or departed from what you expected, how it was the same or different. And then in step 4, you're looking at figuring out what you should modify or maintain. What does this mean? Okay, we've discovered this, so what are we going to do about it? If these slides look like they were copied and pasted from another presentation, they sure were. With the researchers' permission, I copied and pasted this from a presentation that I will have a link for at the end here. And notice that in the bottom of this slide, it says, modify or maintain program activity in what ways, for which participants. So Yang Zhao was not the first person to talk about the fact that education needs to be individualized, that what works for one student may not work for another student and may actually be harmful to him or her. Putney and Wink did this slide years before Zhao came out with that, and I think we all know that, but it's something that we need to be thinking about as we do each individual intervention. Here is a slide that shows it all in one place, steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. It looks like a lot of information, but you notice a lot of it is repeated. Step 3, you're just looking at each individual part of that and whether it was congruent or divergent from what you had hoped or thought would happen. And in step 4, it's just modify or maintain, modify or maintain. What should we change and what should we keep the same? So in your notes in steps 1 and 2, you're just writing down the factual information. In step 3, you're reflecting on it. And in step 4, you're making decisions based on what you found. This can be used, I've been giving some examples, but I am giving some examples, but I hate to even do that sometimes because then it sounds like it's limiting the tool, whereas you can use it for many, many different things that are not mentioned here. You can use it from a global level down to a lesson level. So on that bottom part there, how I've used it, I used it to evaluate an after-school program at that K-12 school that I was talking about before. I've used this to evaluate some of my lessons and my individual interventions. One very special time that I got to use this tool is when my students actually got to use it. I was teaching 8th grade at a new school, and this was actually the year after I was able to help Dr. Putney start her school. I was able to help start another new school. This was a very large district, and it was a K-8 school, and the 8th graders were being rezoned from the schools they had attended. So they attended one school for 6th and 7th grade, and now they had to go to a brand new school for 8th grade. And a lot of them felt like it was something that was happening to them. And I was able to adapt the karma and put some constraints on it because the 8th graders are not able to completely choose what will be modified and maintained, but they could make recommendations to administration. So it was a very positive experience, and they were able to interview their peers and make recommendations and use the karma to come up with things that were important to them and things that they were glad about their new school that they didn't have at their other school. They were able to use it and come up with very constructive things to say when we went in to meet with the principal. I use this tool in an after-school program to evaluate it the first year of its implementation. I looked at these areas: funding, facility usage, staffing, length of program, safety and sign-up, in and out procedures, and programming. Like I said, it can be used at any level to evaluate what anybody's doing on a larger or smaller scale. So there are 4 steps that I already went through in the karma, and now I'm going to go through a specific example, and this is from Putney and Wink's presentation. And this is Kathleen, and she has there's one slide here for each of the 4 steps, and she does a lot of writing out here. This would be more like how you would write it out if you were doing this for a class or if you were doing this for publishable research. And if you are interested, if there's anybody watching this who's interested in doing publishable research or for anything else, you can reach out to Putney and Wink. I'll have their contact information at the end there. So you wouldn't have to write this much specific information if you and the other participants know, what you're talking about. It can just be phrases, shorter information. But here's Kathleen's notes. So the teacher or program initiator, this is step one. What are her expectations? She says, I am a 6th grade teacher with a new special needs student in my classroom. I've wanted to make my classroom an inclusion classroom where special needs students remain with me rather than going to resource room. My action research question, how can I alter my curriculum to involve my special needs students more in classroom activities, especially Pedro, who does not speak English? So who is being served or who is involved? All classroom participants, including students with special needs, particularly Pedro, who does not speak English and sits in the back of the room with his coat pulled over his head. And how are participants to be served? Standard 6th grade curriculum, but I have begun to alter it this year with complex instruction model to make the classroom more interactive. I'm using small groups for students to discuss their work before they report it to the whole group. What will be produced by participants in the program? For my social studies in particular, they are working on a group project where they study different ancient peoples and recreate some aspects of their society as if they were anthropologists excavating an ancient site. They will produce a report of their findings as well as construct some sort of replica of life in ancient times based on their skills, and then she talks about the different kinds of things they could produce. In step 2, now she's taught the lesson and now she's looking at what actually happened. So she talks about this was a 6th grade classroom of 25 students. She breaks it down by subgroup. There are 5 groups. How are the participants using the service? Not all of the groups are working well together. Some of the students seem to remain silent while other students do the work. Pedro is especially quiet, still sitting by himself in the back of the room with his coat pulled over his head. I notice Angela seems to be quiet in the group she is in. She is usually more talkative. Carlos told me privately that he did not like to talk in his group because he doesn't know the answers in English. And then what was produced by participants in the program? First day together in these groups for this project, and we're brainstorming topics. I heard a great deal of arguing rather than working toward consensus on their project. So this is, she's being really proactive here. This was the first day of the lesson and she's reflecting upon it. Step 3, compare and contrast what you expected versus what actually happened. How are the participants working together? Expected versus evident, alignment or departure? Kathleen wrote, I expected that students would work well together if they were in groups that they selected. It is early in the school year, however, and perhaps they did not get along last year. I have to rethink how I have grouped them. I wanted to give them choice, but the groups are arguing, so maybe the choice for them should come in what they study, not who they study with at this point. Modify or maintain? I still believe this project will be good for all students, but I have to rethink how I am approaching it. And then as to what was produced, is this expected versus evident? Is there alignment or departure? Kathleen says, there's more bickering than I would appreciate, and we did not get as far in the groups as I hoped. I wanted them to brainstorm topics, but they didn't seem to be able to agree on anything. I will need to change the groups so that they can work better together. Modify or maintain? Some of the articles I read recently suggest I need a more heterogeneous mixing within the groups. I may need to modify my expectations on the project final reports, but first I want to try to approach it from classroom management aspect and see if we can get kids working together better. If that is the case, then the project should be okay to continue without changing the end product. And then finally, step 4, what is going to be modified? What is going to be maintained? Modify my small groups so that I can ensure that the non-English dominant students and the special needs students are getting help from the more experienced others in their groups. I am going to regroup the students into more heterogeneous groups. I noticed that Angela was silenced by the boys in her group, so I am going to move her to a group with Daniel and Michael because they get along well. I will put Pedro in this group so that he can work with Angela and Daniel, who both speak Spanish. Perhaps they can persuade him to join in and at least take off his coat. I will mix the groups up more in terms of achievement levels and language needs. In another group, Mylin offered to translate for Chitsu, so I will put them together with Kevin and Jeanette. I can then group Carlos and Adriana so that they can talk together in Spanish until he becomes more proficient in English. If I group the others in the same way, perhaps I'll get a better outcome. I have been reading articles about how to group the students so that those who have not yet learned English can get some help in their native language. I will use the karma again tomorrow when the students are in groups to see how they are doing and if my strategy of changing groups helped. Too soon to tell about the project, but I think getting the group set up differently will help. I'm going to ask Ramona next door to help me with setting group norms. She does that well in her sixth grade class, and maybe she can help me here. Seems at times we all need to have a more experienced other to help us get things going. So modify, modify, modify. We do this based on what we see going on with our individual learners. And by the way, if the example before you thought, oh, I'm just not going to use that on the lesson level, you might be use it on a different kind of a level. Those are just some examples that were provided. So this tool helps you to modify what you're doing. And going back to what Zhao was talking about, as far as you know, that something that works for in some contexts may not work in others, and this helps you to not just toss something or just keep going with something for that's not going to work for everybody, but to help figure out what's going to work for whom. Some things are, and as far as like, I always thought about like the tossing out of things where we just eliminate, and then it's like, well, that could have been helpful for that one student. So we kind of need to keep that in our wheelhouse just in case that there's a context where we can use it. Some things are not feasible until they are. I am not a global thinker, but Dr. Putney and her educational partner are, and they were able to say, we're going to start a K-12 school all in 1 year with all sorts of special programs that were really unique and amazing things that they were doing with young people. And I looked at their plan and I thought, this is not feasible. But it was, and it is. That school still exists and it's on 2 campuses. So some things are not feasible until they are. That's certainly something I need to remind myself. And some things are not feasible until they have to be. What if we did an entire quarter of the school year with no students on campus? So now is the time where we can realize we can do anything. So if you were thinking of maybe starting something, so, you know, one time you're like, oh, I don't know if that can be done. Some things are not feasible until they are, and some things are not feasible until they have to be. We can study side effects in our own lives too. So let me say, say this, all of the self-care and all of the social and emotional stuff. Yes, not my area of expertise, but I know there are presentations out there from TIE and the DOE conference that talk about very, very well-informed presenters talking about what we can do to take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others, and how we can address our own emotional needs as well as the emotional needs of others. So we can use the karma to talk about, to figure out how we're going to manage our home, how we're going to balance our work in our home, and different things, different choices we can make going forward in different contexts. And always remember, you are not alone. From the book that I mentioned earlier, Loving the Little Years, it's a book for moms by the author was when she wrote it, was the mother of 5 children ages 5 and under. And she said, you know those pain scales at the hospital where they rate your pain from 1 to 10? Well, pretend that you are screaming 13, 13, 15. What that should tell you is that it's time to restart the whole thing, stop screaming, and just deal with the fact that this is now the new 1. Start over and accept the new normal. Now, the person who says that, it makes a lot of difference who you're hearing that from, right? That was one of my favorite things to return to as I was dealing with all of the intensity of having 3 children, ages 3 and under, because I was listening to somebody who had been there, somebody who had 5 children, 5 and under, a more knowledgeable peer. So that I appreciated knowing that I was not in it alone, that I was, you know, that somebody else was dealing with all of the intensity that that I was dealing with. And I kind of like that kind of tough love stuff. I used to have a paper up on my wall that said, put on your big girl panties and deal with it. And it had like a cartoon old lady on there. And I thought, well, this cartoon old lady has probably been through a lot, so I will do just that. But if you're not a tough love person and you'd like something a little bit more gentle, I will give you something that I wrote for you, South Dakota educators. It says, you have skills and strengths that make you an invaluable and irreplaceable educator. Do you believe that? I believe that about you. It's been amazing to work here in South Dakota. I've just so enjoyed meeting so many of you on Zoom or in person or through emails. what standard do you use to evaluate yourself as an educator? Are you using the beyond reasonable doubt standard or the preponderance of evidence standard? Now, I don't know a lot about the law, but I've been on juries. And on one jury, it was a criminal trial, and we had to say, this is true, beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a very high standard. And then on a civil case I was on, we had to say, this might be, that's probably true or probably not true. Like, you look at everything and you say, yeah or no. Is it 51% or 49%? That's called preponderance of evidence. Which standard are you using to evaluate yourself? And in this case, there is one right answer as to what you should be using. You cannot use a beyond reasonable doubt standard to evaluate yourself as an educator. There are always going to be things that you wish you would have done differently. So please use the preponderance of evidence standard when evaluating yourself as an educator. So say it with me. If you're working on something else and just listening to me and not looking up at the slides, look up at the slides right now and take a look at the information that are the words that are in quotations, and let's say it together. The preponderance of evidence suggests that I am a good teacher. Again, the preponderance of evidence suggests that I am a good teacher. Thank you, South Dakota educators, for using your unique gifts for the benefit of South Dakota's young people. Here are my references for the books that I used during this presentation. I used one on the top was not about education, it was about mothering, but I used a couple of quotes from there that I think really applied to our current situation. And then the Zhao book, What Works May Hurt. And on the bottom there is the link to Yang Zhao's website, where you can find out more about the books that he's written, as well as a blog. And also he has now a new podcast. His most recent book is called An Education Crisis is a Terrible Thing to Waste, and it's about entrepreneurship in schools and why that's good for all students, even if they don't plan to be entrepreneurs. And he has examples even down to a first grade classroom where they did entrepreneurship and learned all sorts of very important skills. Putney and Wink, Dr. Leanne Putney is at UNLV, and this is her preferred email address. And Dr. Joan Wink is here in South Dakota. And that is her website. Like I said, has a blog and lots of information on it about her books and things like that. And I don't know if I mentioned it, there's a little search bar at the bottom of the website. So you can put things in there, if what you'd like to find out, or just kind of scroll through her information that she has there. The book that she wrote that most applies to what we talked about today is Critical Pedagogy, Notes from the Real World. There's a citation there. There's the website where their one of their earlier presentations was, and that's where I copied the slides from. And then that's the reference there is on toward the bottom is when the Karma originally came out, and it kind of explains some of the theory behind it and how it can be helpful. My email is at the bottom there. I have a K-12 account, and then also this is my personal email. Okay, say it with me again. The preponderance of evidence suggests that I am a good teacher. I am going to leave you with this slide in case you want to just kind of go back and freeze this after I'm done talking here. I just want to do some final thank yous. I want to thank all of you South Dakota educators, and I want to thank anybody who may be watching this that is not a South Dakota educator, especially those that I worked with in other states before I came here who influenced my teaching. I'd like to give a special thanks to the educators in my district, Go Elks, as well as to my fellow 2019 Regional Teachers of the Year for South Dakota, Dina, Nicole, and Penny. And also especially thanks to our current State Teacher of the Year for South Dakota, Amanda Harris, who has been representing us and leading us with such positivity during this difficult time. So thanks to all of you. And I would play you out with some music, but it's just too much of a labor-intensive process for me. So I am just going to click some buttons here and just remind you that the preponderance of evidence suggests that you are a good, no, a great educator.